there's a false expectation that somehow if we live good lives, we won't suffer, either through persecution or maybe in other ways too. And it means that we have, in a sense, no real theological category for suffering, or at least the one we have is flawed. And as we have just sung, as we come to Christ, we submit first and foremost, we surrender to Jesus, don't we? And because we do that, we're willing to submit to him. And in doing so, we submit, as we've been reminded, to those who have authority over us, providing they're not usurping what God has said. And Peter here in this next section just gives us an insight into how to deal with unjust suffering. That's in the context of sort of earthly masters, but also maybe sometimes we feel it's unjust in the physical sense, that we may be suffering for things that we think, well, why have I got this particular pain or whatever it might be. One of the things we find as you look at this next section, he talks about slaves. And in Peter's day, there was the household code that explained the mutual responsibilities of the various household members, what they did in that particular family setting. And I was trying to think of a situation a bit like Downton Abbey maybe, or even yesterday, just if you watched some of the highlights later on with Kirsty Young, there was, I don't know the name of the lady, but she was one of the ladies who'd helped Queen Camilla. And she was saying it was the equerries. And I don't know what an equerry does, but basically they were the ones who'd guided them through all the things that they had to do to make the events of the day flow smoothly. So they have these different codes, don't we? And what Peter is trying to do here, and what he's doing, is saying that we need to have a code as how we live, even in our cultural settings. We may not have slaves today in our immediate families, but there are parts of the world where there is slavery, and slavery in our minds often makes us think of the taking of those people by kidnapping them and forcing them to move and relocate. The British did that, didn't they? And the Americas, we've moved people across the Americas. Those things that, again, are in our everyday, maybe not every day, but they're certainly being referred to, aren't they, in historical sense, and people reviewing the impact of slavery, even in our world today. But in Roman days, slaves were different, and often they were well educated, and they might actually have served as tutors for the children of the families that they were slaves in. In fact, many of them were physicians. So they were sort of well trained and educated in that sense. And some of them had the opportunity to buy their freedom. And while slavery was never desirable, and the New Testament nowhere affirms it, Jesus never affirmed it, it was a way of regulating their social structure at that time. And Peter's concern was not upholding slavery, but recognizing the importance of having a faithful gospel witness in that structure. How do I live this out so that the gospel can be declared? How does it play out in our own circumstances? Well, we may not be slaves, but many of us work or have worked for companies, haven't we? We are having to give our service for them, albeit in reward. And we may think, well, I'm being treated unjustly for something. And Peter says here that it's not commendable if you are treated seemingly unjustly or being punished for something that you've done that is wrong. So if I am regularly turning up late for work and I face some disciplinary procedure, I can't say that's because I'm a Christian and because they're picking on my faith. They might know I'm a Christian and they might think it's not a very good testimony. So there's sort of a, if you like, a right place for discipline in that context. But if we find that we are being picked on and made fun of in the staff room or in a place because of our faith, or in some cases people are being told that they can't do something because of their faith, then we have to, what Peter says, take that, I was going to say on the chin. It's not quite like that, but we have to be willing to accept that. Peter says it's commendable before God and will be rewarded for it. You may remember in the Beatitudes, Jesus said that blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And we can see many parts of the world where there is great persecution and suffering for being a follower of Jesus. And in some cases, even in our own nation, that has sort of come to the fore more over recent times. But Peter gives us a reason why we should endure it. It's because we're following in the footsteps of Christ, following Christ's example. And the word example, I was trying to research this a bit because I read something that said that actually an example came from the words that we use for children to trace over the letters to learn how to write. So you kept on going over that thing. That was the example, was the one you traced over. Someone could correct me on that if I'm wrong, but I could see that the example is someone or something that we follow. And Peter retraces Jesus' steps through the words of Isaiah in chapter 53, and some of you may have been able to read that even before today, or you know it. And he's showing us Jesus' example left for us. But note that it's more than just an example. It's not just that Jesus did that and somehow we follow it. Actually, he focuses very much on the redemptive work of Jesus. And as we gather around the Lord's table in a moment, just to be reminded of these things that Peter says here. Verse 22, he says that he did not sin. Jesus suffered and died, though he committed no sin and no deceit was found in his mouth. And as we follow in Jesus' steps, we won't escape unjust suffering. But when we suffer, it's not an excuse to sin. Verse 23, Jesus did not verbally lash out. How many of you, when you are being treated unjustly and you've been picked on, you want to, well, I have a tendency myself to want to justify myself. Even if I'm not being attacked in that sense, we want to verbally defend ourselves. But we know that Jesus didn't do that. We're told that, picking on Isaiah, he was led like a lamb to the slaughter. The worldview is that we fight fire with fire. Often if someone's hard to you, you go back to them. But when we trace Jesus' steps, we remember that he didn't revile, he didn't have those words of lashing out, he didn't threaten. In fact, what did he say when he was on the cross? What were those words? Father, forgive them. Father, forgive them. Well, how can we do this again and again, day after day? Well, Peter tells us just a few things here. One was in verse 23, he trusted God. Jesus trusted himself to the Father, knowing that there would be a day of reckoning, and he cared more for the approval of his Father than vindication from people in the present. And we need to be mindful or conscious of God, and that he's the one who we're told will ultimately judge each man's work impartially. Chapter 1, verse 17, Peter reminds us of that. So we need to have recognition that we don't need to take justice into our own hands. We can leave it in God's hands. That doesn't always mean that we shouldn't in our society be salt and light and make a stand for those things that we know to be right. Verse 24 to 25 says, Jesus dealt with our sins in his suffering, and the purpose of Jesus' death was to put an end to sin and to free people to live in righteousness, to be free from the restrictions of a sinful life, of knowing that our sins are forgiven. Jesus paid the penalty for sin on the cross, and he offers forgiveness to those who turn away from their sins. These are things that we know so well, and yet sometimes we become familiar with them, we ignore them. So as we gather around the Lord's table this morning, just remind ourselves of these things. So Jesus paid the penalty for sin, and he offers forgiveness to those who turn away from their sins. And it says that by his wounds that we have been healed. And some take this to mean that Jesus died for everything, for our physical sickness as well. And Jesus does heal. I don't necessarily believe this passage refers to physical healing, but Jesus endured the wrath of God on the cross. Just be mindful of that as we share in the bread and the wine this morning. We were like sheep going astray, but Jesus has made a way for us to return. Well, challenge to me, maybe to us. The sad reality is that, as I said, many of our churches, we are focused on, if you like, a comfortable lifestyle, aren't we? We become comfortable in our materialistic prosperity. As a nation, we're very prosperous. We may not think so, but we are in relative terms. We have our daily comforts. And until recently, I would say there's been a cultural acceptance of being a Christian. I don't know how you found it in your workplaces, but I used to find I could go into work on a Monday and people knew that I had been to church on a Sunday. But that was sort of a bit like them saying they'd been to the gym or had a game of golf or whatever it was. It was just that it didn't impact on them. But as we start talking about Jesus, it has a greater impact. And I think the cultural acceptance of being a follower of Jesus is waning in our nation, and we will face increasing persecution, directly or indirectly. The question I have to ask myself and ask us is, as that comes and as suffering becomes part of, I won't say our daily life, as we faithfully follow Jesus, it will affect us all. It's not just for the super keen followers of Jesus, the super keen believers. So we need to be living a vibrant faith that actually won't go unchallenged. We need to be challenging the world and its views and say, look to God, see what he has done in the cross in Jesus Christ. And at moments of unjust suffering, we will discover who we worship. As we come round the Lord's table, we're going to sing another song just to